I'm posting this video for anyone who is curious about the process of painting your pool, fixing tile or regrouting the tile on your pool. This is more of an overview video. It's not meant to be in depth. It's more for someone who is just curious about the process and they want more information on what that would look like to see if maybe it's something that they would feel comfortable taking on themselves instead of hiring out the work. I did put together a rough estimate on what the cost would be to have someone come out and resurface the pool using gunite, also pulling off and reattaching any of the loose tiles and regrouting all of the tiles as well. It was going to be somewhere around $8,000. I decided to look into other options. My neighbor actually painted his pool a year prior to me deciding to do this, and his pool looked great. There was nothing wrong with it. He swore by the paint. So I decided that's a feasible option for me. It was more in line with my budget at the time, and this is going to be the process on what that looks like. So what you're seeing here is the gunite wearing away. When the pool is full of water, it's not as noticeable, but it does look like stains throughout the pool. I had a pool guy come out and he concluded the same thing, that it was indeed the gunite wearing away. It was worse in this area because there was a waterfall there, or water feature that pours off from the spa into the pool. And it really looked like just bad stains when looking through the water. There was some gunite kind of mixed in the filter, so I had to clean the DE filter more often than I normally would have to. Outside of that, it was more of just an aesthetic appeal issue. It just made the pool look dirty. It never really sparkled and looked clean. Outside of the tiles just being really dirty, we had a lot of tiles around the pool that looked like this. They were coming out away from the rest of the tiles. Whether it was thin set, not put on correctly at the beginning, or maybe something in the concrete behind it is protruding out, not allowing the tile to be pushed flush against with the rest of the tile. For whatever reason, I was able to pull most of these out with my fingers. A lot of them were loose. This one eventually did come out, but a lot of them fell off themselves. We just found them floating in the pool. The grout lines were just horrible throughout. And then we had typical things of bolts rusting out that I replaced. The first step in the process is draining the pool. I purchased this 100-foot fire hose from a company called JME Ellsworth. It's more rugged than the typical PVC hoses that you would find at Home Depot or Lowe's used for backwashing your filter. And since I was going to be dragging this out on a regular basis, I needed something that was more durable, something that wasn't going to develop little pinholes in it and shoot out chlorine water all over my grass and my neighbor's grass. I did have to buy basically a adapter that connected it to my backwash line there on the PVC, and then I just store it in this bin when it's not in use. Step 2 in the process was pressure washing. I tried to do a pretty thorough, detailed job pressure washing. Two of the reasons were, first off, I wanted to see if I could get any of the loose grout out from between the tile. Second was I needed to see if the gunite was going to peel away and start chipping under pressure. If that was the case, then unfortunately I don't think painting would have been a viable solution. I would have had to pay the money to get it resurfaced with gunite. But everything was pretty well adhered. So at the end of the day, I discovered that painting was still going to be a viable path forward for me. But if you go through this process and it's just chipping off at this point when you're pressure washing, and you're just leaving a lot of holes or gaps. Here's one hole right here that I ended up patching with some pool patch that they sell at any pool store. But as long as everything's still pretty well adhered, in my opinion, and I'm no expert, but in my opinion, I think that it's safe to move forward with the paint. Step number 3 would be removing all of the loose tiles. I just went around and pulled them off with my fingers. I guess you could use a tool if you're really careful not to break the tile, but what you'll notice is some of the thin set is stuck on the back of the tile, and sometimes the thin set doesn't come off at all. It's just staying adhered to the concrete behind it. This is really a pain to get off. We'll see this here in a minute. Really, it's a pain because you don't want to use a tool that's going to break this tile or crack it or split it in any way, because there's no way I'm going to find this tile anywhere, because it's just so outdated, and you're probably going to be in the same scenario. So I would suggest just taking your time during this process and just being very careful not to break any of these pieces of tile. And I'll show you here in a second how I was able to get the thin set off from behind the tile and from the concrete itself. Step number 4 is going to be removing the thin set from the concrete and from the tile so you can reuse the tile. I tried a couple of different tools for this process. The first tool I tried was just a scraper that you would buy at Home Depot or Lowe's, and it was really tough. It was hard to make any progress at all in a reasonable amount of time, and it just took a ton of manual effort, and there was no way I was going to be able to complete this task without just running out of steam or running out of time.
It's a prison mode. Shaking somebody.
There are times in life where you just thank yourself for spending money on a tool that is just well worth it. And this is exactly one of those times. This made quick work of what would have been a horrible manual process that just would have made this entire experience unbearable. Vacuum, vacuum, vacuum. I pretty much vacuumed between every step. This is still part of step number 4. I'm just removing the thin set from the back of the tile. If you've never used one of these tools before, it can take a little bit of time to get used to it. Probably you're more used to a reciprocating tool, as in the bit goes out and in. This is an oscillating tool, so the bit is swinging rather side to side. It takes a little bit of time to get used to that, but once you get used to it, it's fine. You just gotta kind of keep in mind of the motion so you don't break the tile. And I would say just make sure that you're not rushed. You have enough time to complete this process without feeling like you need to do it fast. Last thing you want to do is break one of these tiles and be in a position to where you can't find a replacement. Step number 5 is re-adhering the tile to the surface of the pool. For that, I used a thin set called Mappy Mosaic and Glass Tile Mortar. The thing to keep in mind with this that's not inherently transparent from the outset is this requires an additive if you're going to use it for underwater purposes such as a pool. So just make sure that you kind of read the fine print on anything that you buy. If you go with this, just remember that you have to buy this additive for anything that's submerged underwater. When pulling off these tiles, oftentimes it would pull off the thin set and some of the concrete behind it, leaving behind a hole or some gaps. I was trying to think of a way outside of just loading up a putty knife and trying to press it in to fill these holes. I remember my wife in the kitchen decorating a cake, and she would fill up an icing filled Ziploc bag and cut off the corner. And I thought maybe I could use that same trick here. So I'm trying to squeeze it in the holes and cracks instead of pushing it in the holes and cracks with a putty knife. It worked out pretty well. Technically, you're not supposed to do it this way. You're supposed to use a trowel and create basically channels in the thin set so it spreads out evenly. I did it a pyramid style because I found that I needed more thin set than even the deepest trowel would allow for this scenario. I don't know if it's because I'm replacing tile and not just laying out the thin set and then troweling it on the surface and adding the tile all evenly. So this method worked out best for my application, and then I just kind of came behind it and scraped off the excess thin set that seeped out the edges. And then I just used the typical tile spacers to evenly spread out all of the tiles. Step number 6 is removing the grout. I started out using this tool. It's a manual grout removing tool that resembles a box cutter. It has like a diamond grain embedded on the edge, and essentially you have to try and fit this tool in between the tile and move it back and forth. The problem is it's extremely tight area where I'm working, and it's really a pain. I quickly determined that this is probably a job best suited for the oscillating tool. This teardrop shaped bit paired with the oscillating tool was just amazing. It ate through the grout like it was butter. The problem that you run into with these tools, however, is you don't want to eat away at the ceramic edges of the tile. So you don't want to widen the gap on these by eating away at the edge of the tile, because that's going to be really noticeable in your grout lines when you put fresh grout in. Outside of vacuuming, this is probably the easiest step of all. So essentially you're just mixing up your grout. I tried to make it the consistency of maybe peanut butter, maybe a little bit of runnier peanut butter. And you're just using this grout float to float it out and push it into all of the gaps. You don't really have to worry too much about keeping it off of the tile, because we're going to come behind it here in a second to remove any of the grout that's on the tile surface itself. Step 7 is called etching. It sounds like maybe a scary process, but it's pretty straightforward and simple. It's similar to just cleaning the surface. The only difference is you're cleaning the surface with a very diluted acid. It's 10% acid, 90% water, and you're just going to spray this acid on the surface. You're going to come behind it with a pool brush or any kind of brush you have on a pole, and you're going to work it into the surface. Then you're going to rinse it off. Then you're going to repeat that process again and just rinse it off really well. And then let it dry, and then probably want to vacuum again. Essentially what you're doing is just you're etching the surface. You're making the surface more porous so it's easier for the paint to adhere. For some reason I can't find my footage for this process, so I'm just going to leave a link in the description on the process that I followed. Oh yeah, and definitely make sure you wear safety gear. We finally made it to the end, step number 7, and that's where we finally get put on the paint. What I would recommend is using painter's tape all along any of the edges that the paint is going to end. In my case, it's the tile here. Yes, it took a very long time to go along the edge with that blue painter's tape, but I think it's definitely well worth the effort. You can see right here where I painted right above the tape, and if that tape wasn't there, I would have got on the tile. Technically, you can scrape it off of tile, but it's just much easier, in my opinion, to put the tape around all the edges. Applying the paint in this scenario is pretty much applicable to applying paint in any other scenario. You just want to make sure you get even coats, and I'm not going to go too much into detail on how to paint because I assume most people know how to do that fairly well. I will say that I applied 3 coats. In between coats, I probably waited about 6 hours. And then each coat was probably, I would say, not very thin, but not very thick, somewhere in the middle. And then I let the paint sit and cure in the sun for a good 48 hours before I added any water to it.